motor cortex is mostly consists of two regions here, area 4 and area 6 in Brodmann's areas. The primary motor cortex is right here in this strip called the central sulcus. So again, these two regions here are what we consider to be motor cortex. Area 4 is really the primary motor cortex. So this region here, area 4, also called M1, or again primary motor cortex, consists of this strip of the this gyrus right in front of the central sulcus, which is also called the precentral gyrus. So if you remember, this region we call the precentral gyrus, and then this gyrus right behind it we call the postcentral gyrus, and that is the primary somatosensory cortex. So the primary motor cortex and primary somatosensory cortex are right next to each other. So area 4 is again where most of the neurons that are going to form the descending spinal tracts have their cell bodies, and the cell bodies are arranged in a somatotopic map again. So that means if you look at the positions of neurons within this region, so again this is we're talking about we're looking at a cross section of the left side of the brain through primary motor cortex. So this is a coronal section. So you're seeing the dorsal side of the brain up here, and the medial or lateral side over here. And so what this diagram says is that there are neurons in each of these regions that control different parts of the body, and they're arranged in a way that more or less lines up with those parts of the body. So neurons that are next to each other in the motor cortex control parts of the body that are next to each other. So that means, for example, up here, the parts of motor cortex that control the shoulder are right next to the neurons that control the elbow, which are right next to the neurons that control the wrist and the hand, and so on. And of course, we're crossing over. So this is the left side of the brain we're looking at, but these muscles control the right side of the body. So actually this picture is kind of backwards because this shows a left hand, but really it controls the right hand. And the same goes for the face. Now again, because the nerves that control the facial muscles come out from the cranial nerves, while the nerves that control the body come out through the spinal nerves, the part of the cortex that maps to the face is in a slightly different position, but still within that region you have a somatotopic map. So you have the muscles that control the eyelids and the eyeballs next to the ones that control the eyebrows and the facial muscles, and then the neurons that control the lips and the jaw and the tongue are all next to each other too. And again, these are all parts of the body controlled by skeletal muscle, and the only kind of internal part of the body that's under control of motor cortex are those of the tongue and the throat. So those involved in swallowing and speaking too are found here in the motor cortex. Whereas there are parts of the brain that can have influence over the muscles of, say, the digestive system and so on, but that's not controlled by this region. And you may notice, or this may look familiar, because the primary somatosensory cortex is also somatotopic, and it's right next to the primary motor cortex. So this again is the map. These are the regions we're talking about. So primary motor cortex is right here in red. Primary somatosensory cortex is right here in green. They both have a somatotopic map that is pretty well lined up. So for example, the parts of somatosensory cortex that receive touch input from the face are right across the central sulcus from the parts of primary motor cortex that control the face. And so that's probably no accident. In fact, that may be why they are arranged that way. In fact, for whatever reason, in this diagram, at least the the region of the somatosensory cortex they correctly drew as a right hand, because this is the left side of the brain, whereas the motor cortex, I think that was just an error on the printing here. This should be a left hand in this diagram, because these muscles, or this part of the brain, controls the muscles on the left side of the hand. But the somatotopic map, again, looks very similar to the somatosensory somatotopic map, not just in position, but also in the relative sizes. So again, with the somatosensory cortex, you see a large overrepresentation of the lips and the hands, because again, that's where you have a high degree of sensitivity of touch receptors in those regions. And the same is true in the motor cortex. So the hand, the fingers, the lips, the jaw, the tongue, all have a much higher degree of representation in motor cortex than, say, the arms, for example, even though there's much more muscle. So in other words, the number of muscles, or the amount of muscle in the say the arms, the shoulders, the trunk, is much greater than in the hand. But the hand requires so much more control. The muscles of the hand require a lot more control than the muscles of those other parts of the body, because of the way we use that body part. We use our hands to manipulate objects, to use tools. Things like writing, for example, requires a lot more fine control of the individual finger muscles than, say, walking. So that's also why, like, the hands have a lot more representation in the motor cortex than the feet. You just don't need a lot of really fine control of the muscles in your feet to walk or to stand, but you need a lot of fine control to independently control the fingers, to use tools and so on. Same goes for the lips, jaw, and tongue. So we use those body parts, those muscles, for for example, speaking. So speech requires a lot of fine control of the muscles of the lips and the tongue and the jaw, and so that's why those muscles, or those body parts, are so overrepresented in motor cortex, because of the way we use those body parts, not because of their size or because of the amount of muscle or anything like that in those regions. And then adjacent to area 4, you have area 6. So area 6 is just anterior to the to area 4, what's called the primary motor cortex. And this is then subdivided into two regions: the supplementary motor area, or the SMA, and the premotor area, or the PMA. And there's also a somatotopic map within this region. The SMA controls mostly the distal motor unit, so that means the muscles of the arms and legs. And then the premotor area is more involved with the muscles of the proximal motor unit. So that means muscles that are closer to the midline of the body, like the shoulders and hips and so on. And the neurons in area 6, both area 4 and area 6 neurons, again, control motor neurons in the spinal cord. So they control the muscles of the body that they map onto. And area 4, again, it seems to send direct commands to, we'll actually talk later about how area 4 controls muscles, but area 6's job seems to be, at least in part, involved in planning of motor actions. So in other words, before a movement is actually initiated, there seems to be some activity in area 6 that is necessary for sort of planning out movement. So again, we're talking about sort of the tactics, strategy and tactics level of movement here. And so this is an example, this is an experiment that kind of demonstrates the role of area 6. So this is an experiment where they trained a monkey to push these buttons on this board in front of it. So the buttons are these little circles, and the monkey is trained to push one of the buttons when it lights up, but it's trained to wait, or it's trained to look at the board, because before the button it's supposed to push lights up, another light, the little square boxes, will light up to tell the monkey which button it's going to have to push. But it knows, and again, you can train monkeys to do this after a few trials, but it's trained that to wait for the red light to come on one of these 4 boxes, and that's going to be the instruction stimulus. So that's the instruction to the monkey that's going to say, all right, this little blue button down here is about to light up, and when it lights up, you're going to push it. And so it does that. It waits until the so-called trigger stimulus comes on. So we call the big square light the instruction stimulus, and then the blue light the trigger stimulus. So there's a delay between when the instruction stimulus comes on and the trigger stimulus comes on. So the assumption is that during that time, and it's just a few seconds, during that time, some part of the monkey's brain is preparing to move. In other words, sending out or preparing the motor cortex to carry out that action. And so over here, they're recording from in this case a neuron in the PMA, the premotor area, presumably on the right side. So of course, if the monkey's moving its left arm, then the right motor cortex would be involved in this movement. And so what this shows that when there's no stimulus at all, even though the monkey knows it's going to have to move at some point, this particular neuron that they're recording from is inactive, or it has sort of a baseline level of activity. These little vertical lines again are action potentials. And then it starts to fire as soon as the instruction stimulus comes on. So again, even though the monkey hasn't moved yet, that neuron responds to the instruction stimulus. And it keeps firing again until the trigger stimulus comes on. But then about a split second after the trigger stimulus comes on, and after the movement initiates, so as soon as the trigger stimulus comes on, the monkey starts moving its arm. But at that moment, or a few seconds later, that neuron shut off. So the implication or the assumption here is that this neuron that they're recording from is active during this sort of waiting phase, and the assumption is that neuron is somehow involved in the circuit that's sort of planning out the movement. So it's sort of storing perhaps the sequence of commands that are going to be sent to the primary motor cortex and to the spinal cord to actually carry out the movement. So again, how exactly that movement's stored, or how that command is stored, no one really knows for sure, but that just sort of illustrates perhaps what this part of the brain does. And then outside of motor cortex, there are a number of other cortical regions that send input to motor cortex. So the motor cortex itself is what commands or sends commands to the spinal cord and to the brainstem motor neurons to initiate movement. So the question is, who tells the motor cortex what to do? So there are a couple different regions that send their inputs to motor cortex, including the posterior parietal areas. So these are the posterior parietal areas back here, areas 5 and 7 for the most part. Oops. So areas 5 and 7 are just posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex, and we have heard of these before because we talked about the posterior parietal cortex in the context of the somatosensory system, because of course primary somatosensory cortex is right here, just anterior to those two, and posterior parietal cortex, if you'll recall, is seemingly necessary for sort of integrating sensory input and creating one's sort of sense of the world and their place in it, because, and we know this from people who have had damage to this region, they have what's called hemispatial neglect. This is where, again, someone has trouble sort of processing or dealing with things on the side of their body or the side of the world, essentially, that's contralateral to the injury. So this would be probably someone with a right posterior parietal injury, and they are given a task where they have to copy a picture. So they give them a clock to copy, or a picture of a flower, and they can sort of get some of the image, but they always have trouble with the opposite side. So with the clock, they draw the circle, but they don't draw all the numbers. They only draw the numbers on the right side. or the flower. They draw the stem and the middle circle, but they leave off the petals and the leaves on the opposite side. And again, people with this condition, men only shave one side of their face, women only put on makeup on one side, and so on. So the posterior parietal is at least involved in sort of integrating somatosensory information with visual input and other modalities. And so the assumption is that the posterior parietal area communicates with the motor cortex to, again, sort of coordinate movement on that side of the body with the sensory input coming from that same side. And then you have the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is basically the rest of the frontal lobe that's not part of the motor cortex. So again, motor cortex, strictly speaking, is just areas 4 and 6. And prefrontal cortex is just everything else. And it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's the front of the front. So this is the part of your brain that's all the way at the anterior end. It's right behind your forehead. And prefrontal cortex has a large input to motor cortex. It seems to be involved in a lot of things, obviously with motor planning, so planning out movements, but especially at the higher levels of or more complex levels of cognition. So motor planning both in short term and also long term. So prefrontal cortex, this seems to be important for decision making, kind of anticipating consequences of actions, long term thinking. A lot of abstract thought seems to be involved in the prefrontal cortex. We've seen the prefrontal cortex before, way back at the beginning of the class. We talked about Phineas Gage, so he's a famous example of someone with a prefrontal cortex injury. And if you remember, among other things, he had problems with planning for the future and making decisions. And so that seems to be what the prefrontal cortex is at least partly involved in. And so it sends input to the motor cortex, not necessarily to initiate movement, but there's reason to think that it actually inhibits movement. In other words, it sort of prevents the motor cortex from initiating movements that are not sort of goal oriented. So we'll talk about that more later. Now, again, how the motor cortex actually encodes movement or sends specific movement commands to the spinal cord is not entirely understood and is probably very complicated. It's not the case that individual parts of motor cortex send commands to individual muscles. So that's one possible way the motor cortex could be organized. You could have individual neurons or groups of neurons that send commands to individual muscles to contract, and then you get movement in the corresponding direction. But that doesn't seem to be the way it works. It seems to be the case that different parts of the motor cortex command different parts of the body, and more specifically command movements in a particular direction. And so this can be demonstrated by showing that neurons in primary motor cortex have what are called direction vectors. And the way you show this is by recording activity from motor cortex neurons and then looking for how those neurons are active during movements in particular directions. So an example of this kind of experiment is this one here. You have a monkey, again, trained to sit in front of a board like this with a little joystick. And the joystick sits in the center of this table, and it's surrounded by these 8 lights. And so the monkey is trained that whenever one of these lights comes on, and they just sort of come on at random, to move the joystick in the direction that the light came on. So in other words, if the light to the left comes on, then the monkey knows to move the joystick straight to the left. So this is just a way to train a monkey to initiate a simple movement in a particular direction. And if you record from neurons in the brain, so again, if this is the monkey using its right arm, then it would be we'd be recording over here from the left motor cortex, and presumably the part of the motor cortex that controls the left arm. And what it shows is that these neurons don't fire with just any kind of movement. Neurons in motor cortex seem to prefer or seem to be most active when the motion is in a particular direction. So this is showing for one particular neuron the firing rate for different motions. So 0 degrees in this case would mean moving the joystick directly to the right. 90 degrees would be moving the joystick directly forward. 180 would be moving the joystick to the left, and so on. And 270 would be moving the joystick toward the monkey's body. And so, for example, this particular neuron seems to fire the most when the monkey moves the joystick to the left, straight to the left. It also fires at other angles, so it fires a little bit, here between 180 and 90, and a little bit between 180 and 270. Still fires a little bit at 90 degrees and at 270, but then once you get close to 0 degrees, meaning moving directly to the right, this neuron does not fire much at all. So that seems to be the direction vector for that particular neuron. So the assumption is there would be then another neuron or another set of neurons for each direction. So there'd be a neuron that preferred or had a direction vector for 90 degrees, a direction vector for 0, and so on. And all the degrees in between. It's just that this particular experiment only allowed the monkey to move in 8 directions and in one plane. But then the idea is that a movement is made if when all the neurons sort of collectively add in their direction vectors or fire at different rates given their direction vector, and that determines the actual direction of motion. And so the sum or the average of a bunch of different direction vectors from different neurons all firing together produces what's called the population vector. So this is another example actually of population coding, which we've seen before in the sensory systems. So again, if you have these two cells here, one cell, its preferred direction is 90 degrees, in other words, directly up. And this cell, cell 2, its direction vector is straight to the right. If those two are firing at about the same rate, the same firing rate, then their net movement would be about 45 degrees up and to the right. And so that's all the different neurons firing at different levels or with different frequencies together will produce the actual population vector, which determines the direction of the movement for that body part. So that's presumably how movements are encoded by motor cortex. One last thing to say about motor cortex is that, like somatosensory cortex, and pretty much like every other part of the brain, in fact, it exhibits plasticity. That means that connections within the cortex can change due to development or due to experience. So here's an example of that, where they have mapped the motor cortex of a rat. So of course, the motor cortex of a rat is not as granular as that of a human, or harder to identify individual body parts. But you can still see regions where you have forelimb control here in orange. So that means that if you were to stick an electrode into this part of the brain of a rat, it would the rat, and then stimulate that region with the electrode. The muscles of the opposite forearm, which would be the right forearm, would move. And then down here in yellow, you have the periocular muscles under control. So periocular means the muscles around and attached to the eye. So in this case, you've got in the yellow region neurons that would control the muscles of in this case, the right eye. And in between are the neurons that control the muscles of the vibrissae. Vibrissae is just a fancy word for whiskers. So rats and other animals that rely on their whiskers as important sensory organs also have muscles attached to those whiskers that allow them to move or twitch. And so the vibrissae muscles have their own neurons in motor cortex that control them. Obviously, this is something that wouldn't exist in a human or a primate brain, but that's okay. And then what they did in this experiment is they went in and surgically either cut the vibrissae or cut the nerve that controls the vibrissae muscles. And so that means that the neurons that controlled those muscles are still there, and presumably initially would still try to send commands to the whisker muscles to move. But when those muscles don't send feedback back to the brain, remember we've talked about how sensory structures in muscles can also tell the brain what the muscles are doing. So if the brain isn't getting that sensory feedback from the muscles that they're moving, then over time, if you go back and map the motor cortex of this rat later, you see that there are no more neurons, obviously, that control the vibrissae anymore because the vibrissae can't move. But the question is, what happened to those neurons? The neurons are still there, so somewhere in this region there are neurons that used to control the vibrissae muscles. But now, when we stimulate those muscles, or those neurons, instead, for example, these neurons here that used to control the vibrissae, now they activate periocular muscles. Whereas here, you had neurons that used to control the vibrissae. Now, when they are stimulated, they cause movement of the forelimb. So again, that's an example of plasticity. The neurons in here now are reconnected, have rewired themselves essentially to the neurons that control adjacent body parts. Again, same thing happens with people. So this is an example where this is an experiment where they trained people to read Braille with one hand. So Braille, you probably know, is a way of printing text as little bumps so that people that are vision impaired can read. And of course, just like any other form of language, it requires a lot of training. So here what they did is they recorded, this is a functional MRI image from some brain. These are averages of multiple people. And they looked at what was going on in their brain when they were reading Braille, and then the little green areas represent the parts of the brain that were active while they were doing this task. And you can see up here that when they first did it, before they actually trained the people to read Braille, the left and right sides give you the same level of activity when trying to do the task because they've never done it before, and so you would expect both sides to kind of contribute the same amount. But then they trained these people to read Braille over a year. So this is a long, lot of practice with reading Braille. And here, what you can see is that on the left side, so presumably they were using the right hand to read Braille. Now, when they record or look at brain activity while people are reading Braille, after a year of training, the parts of the brain that are active on the left side are much larger than they were before, and much larger than they are on the opposite side of the brain, which presumably has not been trained to read Braille. So the point is that now you have this plasticity where the parts of the brain that now control the right hand have expanded. Now, they haven't physically expanded, so in other words, the brain didn't get bigger necessarily in that region, but the connections between those neurons and the neurons that control other muscles have expanded, and presumably perhaps at the expense of other parts of the body. So that is one thing about plasticity. If one region is expanding, another region is reducing its connectivity. But in any case, this is just an example of how this would work in a human brain. And the same thing would be true for any other kind of motion that's used a lot or thing you're trained to do. So if you look again at the motor cortex of people who have learned to play a musical instrument, you might see a similar kind of expansion of that part of that circuit of the brain. And again, this happens in pretty much every part of the brain, so it's not limited to motor cortex or sensory cortex or even cortex generally. Plasticity or changing connectivity within the brain due to experience is common to pretty much every part of the nervous system. All right, so next time we will talk about some of the non-cortical or subcortical parts of the brain that are also involved in movement.